So this is going to be a video on the whole doctrine of the atonement, as I think it's one of the most, if not the most, central doctrines of Christianity. And yet, despite the fact that really the entire coherence of Christianity rests on this very doctrine, namely the doctrine whereby Christ, through his life, death, and resurrection, frees mankind from sin and enables him to share eternal life, despite the fact that the entirety of Christianity rests on this doctrine, there doesn't actually seem to be a uniform consensus as to which theory of atonement is to be the definitively held theory by the faithful. There is indeed, in fact, much room for theologumenon on this subject, spanning across really all ages of the church's intellectual tradition. And while it is important for there to be a wide range of healthy theological debate on certain issues, it's also a little bit regrettable that, at least concerning dogmatic theology, that is, there is to an extent a lack of synthesis concerning these competing theories. Now, I'm under no illusions that I'm going to bring about that synthesis, of course. I mean, I'm just a guy on Twitter and YouTube. But what I do want to do is sort of maybe offer some helpful thoughts, at least, that might contribute to that synthesis, which obviously has been going on far outside my competency. But I do want to bring to bear maybe some helpful theological reflections that might help some of you work toward that synthesis in your own thinking. So what I want to do here is kind of focus on three differing theories on atonement within the church's tradition, which I'm going to try to show that they're not mutually exclusive with respect to each other, but simply reflect different aspects of the entire Paschal mystery and its salvific ends, albeit modifying them somewhat in the process. Now, these three theories are, first of all, the ransom theory, secondly, satisfaction theory, and then recapitulation theory. I'm going to try to give detailed explanations of each one, after which I'll give some objections and resolutions to those objections, and then followed by an attempt to sort of synthesize them all into a coherent, comprehensive whole. Now, before going into the nature of these differing theological schools of thought, I think the importance of this doctrine should be emphasized a little bit more. And that is that this is not simply one theological doctrine among many. As St. Paul says, quote, "But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised. If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. We are even found to be misrepresenting God, because we testified of God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised," unquote. So, given that, I think it's safe to say that this is arguably the most foundational and fundamental doctrine of Christianity. And while it can certainly be argued that the two most important are the Trinity and the Incarnation, it's the doctrine of atonement which centers on how mankind can partake of the divine nature. Without this doctrine, God would remain inaccessible and unapproachable from the standpoint of our fallen nature. And it's only because of the atoning sacrifice of Christ that man has any hope of partaking of the divine life. As Christ himself said, quote, "For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and give his life as a ransom for many," unquote. He designates his own atoning sacrifice as the primary reason for entering into the world. Not so much to preach his illuminated doctrines, nor to act as a moral exemplar. Of course, he does both of those things, but primarily to lay down his life for the sake of the many. So I think it's absolutely necessary that this doctrine is assessed historically and properly, and then synthesized from the differences between those assessments across the centuries. So the first theory that we mentioned, namely the ransom theory, stems back in its formulation back to the early days of the church in the patristic era. It was put forward primarily, as I'm sure a lot of you know, by Origen of Alexandria, and the basic principle of this is that through the sin of Adam, humanity had subsequently been placed under the oppressive dominion of the devil, sin, and death. No longer under God's grace, the devil held man captive, and man thus became a slave to the consequence of sin, namely death. Man could not break free from the chains of this dominion because, being a finite creature, there was no way for man to reach out to the divine on his own. So the only way in which man could be freed from the dominion of the devil, in the mind of Origen at least, is for the ransom to be paid to the devil in order that mankind, being held captive, could then be set free. As he says in his own commentary on the Gospel of St. Matthew, quote, "But to whom did he give his soul as a ransom for many? Surely not to God. Could it then be the evil one? For he had us in his power until the ransom for us should be given to him, even the life of Jesus, since the evil one had been deceived and led to suppose that he was capable of mastering that soul, and he did not see that to hold him involved a trial of strength greater than he was equal to." So, in other words, the devil's underestimation of Christ's majesty turned out to be his own downfall, because in the payment of the ransom, the glory of Christ was such that it overcame the devil and defeated him, as well as death itself, culminating in the resurrection and winning for mankind the glory of eternal life. Now, this theory, as one could say as ingenious as it is, nevertheless was not particularly well received among subsequent fathers, as I'm sure would be naturally understandable. The very idea that the devil would be owed a ransom to be paid in order to release poor souls under his dominion was seen by many fathers, particularly St. Gregory Nazianzus and St. Gregory of Nyssa, as if the devil had rights that had to be respected in order for God to redeem the fallen nature of man. And this really seems to fly in the face of God's justice, omnipotence, and of course his absolute primacy in the whole order of providence. Now, as just mentioned, St. Gregory of Nyssa seems to be one of the main fathers that sufficiently takes it upon himself to sufficiently modify this theory so as to avoid these obviously problematic theological implications. So instead of Christ actually owing a ransom to the devil, St. Gregory of Nyssa rather sees the ransom as essentially an act of divine trickery, not only to the devil, but in a way to sin and death itself. As he says, and this is a bit of a long quote, so bear with me, quote, "Now, since a ransom belongs only to him who holds in bondage, I ask, to whom was this offered and for what cause? If to the evil one, fie upon the outrage. If the robber receives ransom, not only from God, but a ransom which consists of God himself, and has such an illustrious payment for his tyranny, a payment for whose sake it would have been right for him to have left us alone altogether. But if to the Father, I ask how? For it was not by him that we were being oppressed. And next, on what principle did the blood of his only begotten Son delight the Father, who would not receive even Isaac when he was being offered by his father, but changed the sacrifice, putting a ram in the place of the human victim? Is it not evident that the Father accepts him, but neither asked for him nor demanded him, but on account of the incarnation, and because humanity must be sanctified by the humanity of God, that he might deliver us himself and overcome the tyrant and draw us to himself by the mediation of his Son, who also arranged this to the honor of the Father, whom it is manifest that he obeys in all things." Unquote. So Christ had absolutely no intention whatsoever on this view to render the devil some kind of due, because of course we know that the devil isn't owed anything by virtue of the fact that he's eternally damned, and the fact that God is no man's debtor, and as the lover of mankind, he would not hold hostage humanity to such absurd a condition. But nevertheless, the appearance of rendering some kind of ransom unto the devil is to remain intact, yet not in the order of divine intentionality, so to speak. In the order of divine intentionality, Christ's divine nature is cloaked, as it were, by the lowliness of human flesh. So as per theologian Carl Adam, this seems to echo a certain certain Pauline undertones with respect to the condescending element of the incarnation, whereby Christ does indeed lower himself into union with flesh, which in a way masks his divinity. Now, of course, St. John rather seems to treat the humanity of Christ as a window into his divinity, but these two shouldn't be taken as contradictory. Nevertheless, St. Gregory of Nyssa does seem to be drawing on the former of these visions and not the latter. For it's precisely because Christ's humanity, in a sense, cloaks his divinity by virtue of its lowliness that the devil is tricked into not recognizing the hypostatic union of Christ, as it were, and as such he takes the bait. Now this is quite different, of course, from Origen's account, insofar as Origen seems to really reify the ransom paid to the devil, and indeed to death itself, and this transactional agreement between Christ and Satan, while the divine trickery still does play a role, is seen as ontologically real, and indeed contributes to the whole efficacy of a divine redemption. Now, St. Gregory of Nyssa, on the other hand, doesn't seem to reify the transactional nature of this process as much as Origen does, but rather he, in a more, we could say, maybe analogical sense, sees Christ's entering into death and the domain of the devil under the appearance of lowliness. He sees that as enabling his infinite glory and majesty as the eternal Logos to conquer these antagonists to mankind, namely sin, death, and the devil. So that's sort of a brief rundown on ransom theory, both in sort of raw form under Origen and a more modified form under St. Gregory of Nyssa. Now, another theory prevalent among the patristic writers doesn't seem to focus so much on the interplay between Christ and Satan, or even necessarily between Christ and death, but focuses more on the connections between the beginning of creation and its culmination in the atonement of Christ. So it's primarily focused on Christ more as the new Adam, as the one who takes what was broken from the first parents and restores it through his incarnational union with humanity. Now, this theory, referred to as recapitulation theory of atonement, was put forward in its most explicit and prolific detail by St. Irenaeus of Lyon, who lived in the 2nd century. One of his primary tasks, it seems, was to refute some of the Gnostic sects who introduced sort of a plethora of heretical Christological errors into the early church, as I'm sure a lot of you know, which spanned across really centuries of its early development. So in order to take on these Gnostics, St. Irenaeus wrote several refutations in his famous work against the heresies. Now, again, as I'm sure a lot of you know, the Gnostic error seems to be reducible to maybe one foundational principle, which would be that the world of matter and its distinctions, corporeity, sensations stood in ontological opposition to the divine substance, which, according to them, of course, because of its immateriality and transcendence, could not interact harmoniously with material creation. And this led them to interpret Christology, of course, in a wide variety of unorthodox ways. So, for example, obviously, as common knowledge, the Arians refused to acknowledge the Son of God, who assumed a material human nature as identical to the divine, and said precisely because they wedged spirit against matter, they saw the Son as some sort of intermediary principle that could enter into material creation, precisely because the Son, according to them, was ultimately simply a creature. Now, ideas like this served as the primary inspirations for St. Irenaeus' radical emphasis on the role of the incarnation. So for Irenaeus, it is the coming together of humanity and divinity, which serves as the primary principle whereby man is to be redeemed. And you can see this as his primary mode of refuting the Gnostic heretics. So for St. Irenaeus, this coming together of humanity and divinity in the incarnation is seen primarily through the prism of Christ as the second Adam. The account of Adam and Eve, found, of course, in the beginning of Genesis, is wholly integral to Irenaeus's theory of the atonement. And he says, quote, "The Lord, taking dust from the earth, molded man, and it was upon his behalf that all of the dispensation of the Lord's advent took place. He had himself, therefore, flesh and blood, recapitulating in himself not a certain other, but that original handiwork of the Father, seeking out that thing which had perished. And for this cause the apostle in the epistle to the Colossians says, And though you were formerly alienated and enemies to his knowledge by evil works, yet now you have been reconciled in the body of his flesh, through death, to present yourselves holy and chaste and without fault in his sight." He says, you have been reconciled in the body of his flesh, because the righteous flesh has reconciled that flesh which was being kept under bondage in sin and brought into friendship with God, unquote. So the Logos does not simply unite himself on this view to some abstract nature of humanity disconnected from its roots in the first parent. So contrary to his again, Gnostic interlocutors, the incarnation cannot be disentangled from anthropological history, but of course is embedded in it. According to Irenaeus, Adam originally fell by prematurely attempting to appropriate the gift of deification on his own terms, despite the fact that God did not see Adam and Eve as yet ready to partake of his nature. For he also says, quote, "But things which are made by God, inasmuch as they have not received a beginning of their existence at a later time, must fall short of the one who made them. Things which have come into existence recently cannot be said to be unoriginated, and to the extent that they are not unoriginated, they fall short of being perfect. For, inasmuch as they have come into being more recently, they are infants, and inasmuch as they are infants, they are unaccustomed to and unpracticed in perfect discipline. A mother can offer adult food to an infant, but the infant cannot yet digest food suitable for someone older. Similarly, God, for his part, could have granted perfection to humankind from the beginning, but humankind, being in its infancy, would not have been able to sustain it," unquote. So the failure of Adam consists, therefore, in his attempt to obtain a share of the divine nature on his own terms before the time that God, in his wisdom, would have deemed it apt to him to share that divine nature. So in so doing, he has cut himself off from sanctifying grace and becoming thereby indebted to the power of death and the devil. So what then is the nature of atonement on this view? Differing from the medieval and scholastic theories of the atonement, the primary focus here seems not to consist in any singular act on the part of Christ, even his death necessarily, but being sourced in the incarnation. For St. Irenaeus, the atonement is an ongoing process beginning in the very infancy of Christ. St. Irenaeus takes very seriously the role of Christ as the new Adam. Adam, summing up the whole of humanity in its efficient cause, must be restored by a new summation of humanity, one could say, in its final cause, culminating in the entire life of Christ. Christ's mission, then, is to redeem and to restore Adam, and by extension, the whole of humanity in its totality, of which Adam was, we could say, the microcosm. So then, by what means is this done according to Irenaeus? Well, it is done principally by the hypostatic union of the incarnation itself. In other words, Adam, by his own sinful disobedience, placed himself, and by extension the whole of humanity, outside of the aura of the Spirit by depriving himself of sanctifying grace. And once this has been done, humanity was deprived of the means whereby man could attain union with God, which is the sole reason for which man was created in the first place, to partake of the divine nature in perfect harmony with God's inner Trinitarian life. Union with the Spirit was essential for this to take place, and because it is the Spirit that binds the love between the Father and the Son, it is therefore also the Spirit which enables one to be bound up within God's inner life of Trinitarian love. And so in order for this to be rectified, there must be a recapitulation of God's original intention of man. and this is fulfilled perfectly in Christ. Christ possesses the Spirit as to his very nature, as the incarnate Word, and by this very union with Adam's humanity is able to recapitulate what was lost with absolute perfection. So according to Irenaeus, it is because Christ possesses the Spirit that he is able to restore what was lost in Adam. And the role of the incarnation, therefore, is to repay, as it were, Adam's original existence, yet under the hypostatic union of God and man in Christ. Christ, therefore, is born of a natural woman, and hence retains a connection to Adam's very humanity. And Christ endures the temptation in the desert, which is very important for Irenaeus's recapitulation model, because this is the first significant rectification that occurs in the life of Christ. Adam failed his test of spiritual maturity by yielding to the attractions offered by the serpent, whereas Christ resists them in perfect harmony with the will of the Father. So this restoration of Adam's fallen humanity is culminated in his death, whereby Christ's communion with the Spirit present in his humanity is so united with God, which was the original intent for Adam, that death can have no dominion over Christ. And through his death and resurrection, understood as the same substantial event, is vanquished, and eternal life is won for mankind. So for the patristic, we could say maybe the classical model of the atonement, this focuses primarily on the efficacy of Christ's incarnation and his death and resurrection as more or less understood as logical consequences of that hypostatic union of the incarnation. And it would not be until, let's say, the early medieval period that theologians would begin to throw a little bit more light on the role of Christ's suffering and death as a bit more integral in themselves to the role of the redemption of mankind. And the overarching theory to establish that is going to be referred to as the satisfaction theory of atonement. So what then is the satisfaction theory of atonement? Well, this theory has undergone quite a bit of development and modification over the centuries since its explicit introduction into the church's intellectual tradition. And it's more or less taken, I think, two primary schools of thought in its chronological order. And those would be Anselmian and Thomistic. Now, the Anselmian doctrine was explicitly introduced into Christian thought, of course, by its originator, St. Anselm, whose theory serves as more or less the bedrock for all the subsequent variants and developments of the satisfaction model. St. Anselm first articulated his theory, of course, in his famous treatise, Cur Deus Homo, wherein he attempted to give a rational and logical account as to why God would have become incarnate. He was a bit dissatisfied, I think it's safe to say, with the traditional ransom theory that we just discussed, which was at that point still quite, popular in the West. But specifically, he was dissatisfied with the notion that God would have to render a debt to Satan, or even to death itself, in order to redeem the rest of mankind who had been held captive under their domination. And this seemed to, of course, run counter to the whole idea of divine omnipotence and the fact that, theologically speaking, God owes no debt to anyone. So instead of seeing the atonement as a payment of ransom to Satan or even to death, St. Anselm reoriented the whole order of debt in this whole equation of atonement. And so instead of God rendering a debt to Satan or to death, it is mankind that owes the debt to God, namely the debt of honor. And it is man who owes the debt, not God, emphatically not God. So St. Anselm will say, quote, he who does not render this honor which is due to God robs God of his own and dishonors him, and this is sin. Moreover, so long as he does not restore what he has taken, he remains in fault. and it will not suffice merely to restore what has been taken away, but considering the contempt offered, he ought to restore more than he took away, unquote. So for Anselm, sin robs God of the honor that is due to him by an uprightness of will. It is not sufficient, therefore, merely to restore what has been robbed of God, sourced in the particularity of the sin, but also one has to make up for the offense against God's honor, which is infinite in its majesty. Since God's honor is infinite in majesty, it is absolutely speaking impossible for any finite creature to satisfy this debt, even by suffering its consequence, namely death itself. So the only way for this infinite gap to be bridged would be if God himself unites to a creature as one person, taking up the penalty of death and therefore satisfying the debt for sin, as well as satisfying the debt owed to God as compensation for robbing him of his infinite honor. Since the incarnate Word is not merely reducible to the human nature of Christ, but is truly the infinite, eternal Logos of God, united to a human nature under one hypostasis, this debt is satisfied by Christ's death due to the infinitude of its majesty because of its divinity. And so the debt is suffered by a subject of infinite majesty, namely God himself. For as St. Anselm says, quote, this cannot be effected except the price paid to God for the sin of man be something greater than all of the universe besides God, quote, unquote. So obviously with all theories, of course, this one is not without its difficulties and objections. And St. Anselm even addresses many of them in his own treatise. One such objection is that given divine omnipotence, why could the Father not simply have chosen a more palatable means of remitting the sins of men? And that it seems unbecoming of the Father to permit such things to befall his Son. And furthermore, it seems also unbecoming of divine justice to delight in the death of an innocent man as somehow necessarily contributive to the salvation of mankind. And St. Anselm will reply to this by appealing to a sort of a reductio ad absurdum chain of reasoning, whereby St. Anselm will suppose, for the sake of argument, the negation of this mode of atonement. And together with this supposition is the supposition against Pelagianism, namely that a man cannot attain his own salvation by his own efforts, and that in order to receive supernatural beatitude, he must attain freedom from sin. But this cannot be achieved by his own natural power, so what would have to follow from that? Well, it would mean that the honor of God would be left unrestored. God acts according to his own divine justice, and so to simply declare these sins forgiven without due reparation would be to contradict the divine justice, which is not arbitrary, but flows from his divine wisdom, which is properly proportionate to our human conception of justice and is not equivocal to it. So for God to let this sin go without due payment would be to rob himself of the honor due to him, which would yield to an unfitting governance of the whole cosmos. And now, God does not require honor for the sake of his own perfection, but permitting dishonor to go without some due satisfaction to his divine majesty would reveal an unfitting governance of the world, and therefore would ultimately be akin to predicating the act of lying of God. And God cannot lie because it would be contrary to his divine nature, as St. Anselm specifies in chapter 9 of his treatise. So, just as lying cannot be predicated of God, given its contradictory relationship to the divine nature, so does the injustice that would ensue from a lack of satisfaction for the sins committed, which robs God of his due honor. So, since man is unable to make this reparation, given the opposition to Pelagianism, which is infinite in value on his own accord, God, in his wisdom, will unite himself to a human nature in order to bridge the gap between God and man. And once this gap is bridged, Christ himself can satisfy the demands of sin by rendering unto God the perfect obedience that would suffer the consequences of sin and thereby restore the whole relationship between God and man by once and for all satisfying the debt that would have gone unpunished had man not sinned. Man then can unite himself to this atoning sacrifice through participation in the church and the sacraments, and thereby will attain eternal life. So this theory, while definitely groundbreaking at the time, went through several, as I said before, modifications through the centuries, most notably St. Thomas Aquinas, who took the bulk of his theory but just modified it a bit, staying faithful, I think, to the core principle of the satisfaction theory, but shifting his focus away from divine justice and more toward the sacrificial, obediential love as the primary cause of the redemption, I think we can say. So what is St. Thomas's precise theory of atonement, and how does it really differ from that of St. Anselm? Well, I think at first and foremost, it's important to understand that for St. Thomas, while he utilizes the whole legal lexicon associated with these theories of atonement, such as payment, debt, satisfaction, etc., what is to be presupposed as an interpretive prism through which to understand these terms in his overall theory is his principle of analogy, which is obviously very famous in the Thomistic system, and that is to say, when terms like debt, punishment, and payment are used, they are not to be used either as a univocal nor really in an equivocal sense, but in an analogical sense. And that is to say, when these terms are predicated of the mystery of the redemption, they are not to be identified in the same sense that these terms are predicable of human notions of payment and debt and satisfaction, etc. This is, of course, similar to how, for St. Thomas, wisdom, mercy, justice, etc., are predicated of God analogically and not univocally. God's wisdom is not to be identified with the wisdom of man as some sort of maximized property, and nor is justice or mercy. Justice, wisdom, and mercy are creaturely analogs that proportionally convey truth about God, but they are not to be understood in the same sense as applied to both God and man. So by a similar, albeit somewhat different sense, these terms are not to be understood in an equivocal sense either. There's a real relation between these creaturely conceptions and their analogates as applicable to the divine, in this case applicable to the mystery of the redemption. They are analogically predicable, but not in a strictly metaphorical sense. These are not just metaphorical illustrations that happen to bear out no real relation to the creaturely conceptions themselves. As Garrigou-Lagrange, I think, helpfully adds to this, quote, "On the contrary, St. Thomas understands satisfaction in an analogical, though strict sense of the term, and not merely in a metaphorical sense, as when being, life, liberty, love, mercy, even vindictive justice, but not anger, are attributed to God analogically and in the strict sense. If we speak of the satisfaction offered by Christ for us, then we speak analogically, but still in the strict sense of satisfaction by the payment of the price offered, because of his supreme love and charity toward God and toward us, even because of his theandric love that is of infinite value," unquote. So with this in mind, when we unpack St. Thomas's doctrine of satisfaction in regards to the atonement of Christ, the analogical nature of these terms have to be kept in mind. And to get into the theory a bit, it must first be noted that St. Thomas, in his doctrine concerning satisfaction, wishes to avoid two extremes which were later put forward explicitly by the early Protestant reformers and later Protestants of the liberal school, I would say. The first of which, more or less aligned with the doctrines of Luther and Calvin, takes the univocal route as expressed above concerning the nature of satisfaction, and that is to say, the legal terms employed are understood more univocally when they are applied to human legal principles and to God. So when it is said that Christ takes upon himself the penalty for sin, punishment is I think, understood in a univocal sense as to imply that Christ was, one could say, maybe even made hateful in the sight of God, taking the place of the wretched sinner so as to be subject to the wrath of God, culminating in his death and subsequent descent. And this sort of paves the way for some Protestant authors to drive a metaphorical wedge between the Father and the Son at Calvary. Now, on the other extreme, the liberal Protestants, representing the Soninians, argued that Christ's redemption of humanity was merely a work of, we could say, moral exemplarism. So there was no true satisfaction on the level of metaphysical reality that one could partake in, say, sacramentally for the ontological remission of their sins. Instead, Christ's work on the cross just exemplified the perfect man that one could morally imitate by way of personal penance and emulation and charity. So Christ is hailed not as the divine Savior conquering sin and death as cosmic realities, but winning for us a wholly extrinsic, exemplary moral charity that one could individually and subjectively imitate in their own interior and spiritual and moral life. Now, needless to say, both of these extremes find themselves at polar opposites, leaving, I think, maybe the golden mean, we could say, of St. Thomas's teaching regarding Christ's redemption. St. Thomas defined satisfaction itself thusly, quote, "He properly atones for an offense who offers something which the offended one loves equally or even more than he detested the offense," unquote. So for St. Thomas, the primary cause of the atonement is not the suffering of a punishment on part of the one who offers the sacrifice, but it's the theandric love whereby God loves the obedience offered by Christ, which is of infinite value given the hypostatic union, and infinitely more he loves this than he hates the offense committed against him by the first human parents, thereby restoring the relationship between God and man. Now, it's important to understand here the key difference between this Thomistic model of satisfaction and what we could call the penal substitution model offered by some of the Protestants. According to the penal substitution model, Christ underwent death on the cross so that he might present our flesh as the price of satisfaction to the just judgment of God, and in the same flesh pay the penalty which we had incurred. And in this Thomistic system, on the other hand, the focus is more or less shifted. Christ does indeed undergo the penalty of sin, not, however, to be subject to the divine wrath, but rather to outpour his own loving obedience and burning charity for the Father, that his meritorious obedience and charity will be loved with a love infinitely exceeding the gravity of the offense committed against him, thereby satisfying divine justice with the theandric love of the Trinity. Now, it is important to understand that while this satisfaction model is the predominant theory of atonement offered by St. Thomas, it does not by any means exclude the other models as disharmonious with it. On the contrary, the right reading of St. Thomas, as per Garrigou-Lagrange, is inclusive of a multitude of models coexisting as different aspects of the same mystery of redemption. Merit, satisfaction, and sacrifice, which constitute the satisfaction model in general, would be the constitutive elements of the redemption, or we could maybe use the term material cause of it. And these are the elements that make up the crux of the mystery. Liberation from sin and death, prevalent in origin and more patristic thought, these would be, we could say, the effects of the mystery. Now, as I will argue, St. Irenaeus' recapitulation model that we talked about, whereby the incarnation is the primary cause of the redemption, this could serve as, to use loosely Aristotelian terms, the efficient cause of the redemption. So these differing theories, while distinct in and of themselves, nevertheless can coexist harmoniously to constitute the whole of the mystery. So how will this look like a bit more spelled out? Well, as I just hinted at, we're going to sort of stick to these causal terms that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar by now if you follow this channel. The efficient cause in this nexus of causality would be, as many of you know, the reason for the existence of the thing, that whereby the thing exists. And it is that from which a thing is caused to exist, or the source of a thing's very existence. The material cause is, as again I'm sure a lot of you know, the constitutive makeup of the thing, out of which the thing is composed, and then the formal cause being the essence or definitional principle of the thing, whence it derives its intelligible meaning. And lastly, of course, the final cause is that for the sake of which the thing exists, or the end or goal that is to be realized in order to fulfill its nature. So what I would say is, when we look at the theory of atonement, each of the theories that I just mentioned can be defended as they fulfill one of these causal principles. And so not only can they exist harmoniously with each other, but they sort of depend on each other in order to retain this mystery's theological coherence. So to get into these one by one here, the efficient cause, and this would be, as we sort of hinted at, the incarnation itself, in keeping with the testimony of the early fathers, such as St. Irenaeus. It is the causal principle whereby there is any redemption at all. Absent the incarnation, Christ's suffering, death, and even resurrection would simply be the work of a finite creature attempting to reconcile humanity with an infinite God. And it is the unification of humanity and divinity by way of divine condensation whereby the atonement is actually effectuated, without which all singular acts of Christ would be completely in vain. So it's Christ's status precisely as the incarnate Logos that is able to draw all men to himself through his passion. For even the holiest of men would still not be able to traverse the infinite gap between God and man. So this is the case both for the patristic framework and the Anselmian framework. While both, of course, are distinct, nevertheless, I don't think they're really contradictory. On the patristic view, the standpoint is taken from the ontological union between God and man that was tarnished and lost from the fall. And through the incarnation, the union becomes medicinally reestablished through Christ, who takes upon himself the new Adam, restoring the whole of mankind through the unification of humanity and divinity through ontological physical union. Now, from the Anselmian view, the incarnation serves as a restorative means of protecting God's divine honor, and thereby mending the wound between God and man, which could only be mended by God, who was infinitely offended against crossing the infinite chasm brought about by human sin. So that's more or less the efficient cause. Now, as to the material cause, as we've said, this would be the actual death of Christ and his sufferings endured on the cross. And these are the material elements which, considered purely in and of themselves as individuated acts, are not sufficient to effectuate the redemption, but are, however, the constitutive means whereby the redemption is effectuated. Considered by themselves, though, they are without redemptive meaning, without form, we could say. They are not per se redemptive, except insofar as they are imbued with the formal element of divine sacrificial love. And it is the divine intentionality to restore his relationship with mankind through joining himself to a human nature, in order that the human nature so joined would outpour its obediential love to the Father through sacrificial suffering, which in its perfect union with the divine essence produces an infinite treasury of merit, even unto death on a cross. This incarnational outpouring of sacrificial theandric love would be the formal element of the atonement, because it is the sacrificial love which imbues the ontological substance of redemption as redemption into the material acts of Christ's suffering and death. God's restorative love for mankind is such that, given the fall of man, the very suffering and death of Christ, which in and of themselves would not suffice to restore the relationship between God and man, become the means of salvation, because they are the means whereby God medicinally mends the wounds wrought by mankind's disobedience, achieved efficaciously through the incarnation. The enduring of suffering for the sake of serving the divine will unto death on the cross out of perfect charity toward God on the part of the human creature is a result of the restoration that was efficaciously accomplished already by way of the incarnation, which is why this redemption is of infinite merit, because the infinite love of the Son for the Father in the Blessed Trinity is now made able to be participated in through the union of the Son with a human nature. And it is in this sense that the patristics are right to see the incarnation as the principal focal point of the mystery of the atonement. And this, I think, touches on the final cause of the atonement, which, of course, the final cause being the cause of causes. And this final cause of the atonement would be the purpose for which the atonement is done in general. And it is ultimately what ties all of the other aspects together, subordinating them to this teleological finality. And what is this finality? Well, this is where the value of the ransom theory, I think, comes into picture. The finality of the redemption, which makes use of these other aspects derived from the other theories, consists essentially, I think, in the desire on the part of God for mankind to become partakers of the divine nature. Every other aspect of the atonement is therefore in some way subordinate to this final end to be fulfilled. As St. Athanasius says, quote, God became man so that man might become divine, unquote. With these four causal elements in mind, how would this theory of atonement come together as maybe a comprehensive, coherent narrative? Well, I think it would go a little something like this. God created man with the original intention that man would partake of his own divine life, which is in accord with St. Irenaeus' theory of recapitulation, who believed this to be the original intention of mankind and Adam and Eve, although their supernatural elevation was to be a gradual process of spiritual maturation. Thus, mankind was originally created under the subjection of the body to the soul and the soul to God. As St. Thomas says, quote, it is clear that the subjection of the body to the soul and of the lower powers to reason was not from nature, otherwise it would have remained after sin, since even in the demons the natural gifts remained after sin, as Dionysius has declared. Hence it is clear that also the primitive subjection, by virtue of which reason was subject to God, was not merely a natural gift but a supernatural endowment of grace. For it is not possible that the effect should be greater than the efficiency of the cause, unquote. Since this is the case, the natural consequence for mankind cutting themselves off from this source of harmony with the divine can only be a descent away from the Logos into an unbridled corporeality, which is the essence of what we could call concupiscence. Mankind, after sinning and thereby cutting themselves off from this divinely ordered subordination of the body to the soul and the soul unto God, is cast into the outer darkness of corporeality without order, whereby the passions of man transgress the boundaries of reason and therefore plunge into privation, left only to his own natural devices, which are corrupted by being ordered specifically away from the Logos, which is a worse state than that of pure nature. And what is the consequences of this? Well, since sanctifying grace actualizes the obediential potency in the soul that enables one to attain eternal life, being cut off from that sanctifying grace naturally yields to death. And since the finite cannot traverse the infinite in order to ascend back to God, this would be the case for human nature on a generational level. For as St. Paul says, through one man, death entered the world. Now, how is this to be remedied? Well, there seems to be two levels to this, each corresponding to two general camps of the atonement theory. First, there would be the ontological remedy, which belongs principally to the patristic theories, which focus primarily on sin and death as ontological privations that must be destroyed in the metaphysical order of man, so that he can partake of the divine nature, to have real metaphysical union with God. And this is the most fundamental level of ontology and being for the atonement. And so in this synthesis, it'll serve as, we could say, the more fundamental ground for the atonement. Now, secondarily, there is the order of justice, whereby God's very honor is wounded by disobedience and must be remedied by an act of meritorious and loving obedience. But proponents of this broad satisfaction view of atonement, such as St. Anselm and St. Thomas, are clear in their assessment that this is not, strictly speaking, metaphysically necessary, but belongs to the category of what is fitting according to divine wisdom. But God could very well have reconciled mankind to himself in different ways, or not at all. Of course, given God's desire to reconcile himself to man in this way, it is necessary, according to St. Thomas, but considered in itself, it is not, and God could easily have brought about this in a different way. He chose this way simply because it's fitting according to divine wisdom. Now, it seems that there is some measure of conflict between these two ways of approaching the atonement, because on the patristic view, sin and death are ontological foes to mankind to such a degree that humanity must be renewed, and sin and death have to be stomped out in order for man to partake of the divine nature. This isn't just a matter of divine fitness, but is truly necessary from the standpoint of man. He is under dominion of these dark powers, and he has to be liberated from them. So, to sort of resolve this apparent conflict, the ontological remedy, mainly that of the recapitulation and the ransom, and the order of justice, namely that of satisfaction, they can be fulfilled, I think, in simultaneity with each other, but under different aspects of the same atoning sacrifice. In the order of the ontological remedy, sin and death are metaphysical consequences of mankind having cut himself off from the sanctifying grace, thereby making them fundamentally at odds with the divine nature, which can only lead to a state that is an eternal contradiction to the divine life, which is death. And in order for these powers to be destroyed and mankind to be renewed, God will recapitulate humanity by becoming man himself, and therefore sanctifying everything human through his hypostatic union with humanity. It is the incarnation itself that is the weapon to combat these ontological foes, for only God in union with humanity can blot them out once and for all. And of course, recapitulation is closely tied to ransom, insofar as God's recapitulation of humanity in the incarnate Word is such that it will follow humanity to the furthest extent of the consequences of sin, namely death, paying, as it were, death, its ransom, by entering into death himself, even death on a cross. Now, in entering into death, the incarnational union between humanity and divinity remains, and in remaining destroys it entirely, and therefore culminates in the resurrection. And the resurrection is the effect of divine recapitulation, because only Christ's humanity in union with his divinity could enter into death and result in the resurrection. So the patristic wisdom of centering the crux of the atonement on the incarnation rings true, for it is the power of the incarnation itself which undergoes death and culminates in the resurrection. Now, in the order of justice, and simultaneity with this ontological battle, Christ's suffering and meritorious obedience to the Father, they take the central stage in sanctifying what is fitting to restore God's honor, which was deeply wounded by Adam's disobedience. So it's Christ's willingness to suffer in obedience to the divine will that stores up an infinite treasury of merit, for it is the Son's very love of the Father that is outpoured into Christ's human nature, which links Christ's human nature to the infinite majesty of God, thereby crossing the infinite chasm between God, who was infinitely offended, and man, who offended infinitely. And these two elements, I think, taken together, constitute a fuller picture of the atonement that can reconcile the patristic and the medieval picture without taking only one at the expense of the other. Now, this is the most important doctrine of the Christian faith, so I think it's important that there not be any rupture between the patristic account and the medieval account, or else the foundational mystery of Christianity seems to be a bit fragmented and incomplete. So I hope that was sort of a helpful reflection on this whole topic. I know it was a bit of a long video, but I thought it would just be a good idea to get it out there. I mean, I've been asked about it a lot, and I think it's a very important topic. Now, the next couple of videos that I do are going to be solely devoted to patron requests. I'm sorry that's come a bit late. I'm starting a new semester, but it's slowing down a bit, so I'm able to get those things done in a relatively short amount of time. And if you want to join the Patreon, you can join it. You can, of course, for the $10, you can request a video. I'll make sure that I do it. Don't forget to like the video if you did indeed like it. If you have any questions, you can comment. You can follow me on Twitter. The link is down below. And God bless.